That evening at the hotel, Edward and his husband checked in. Edward worriedly asked his husband about the earlier incident. Was it serious? Why did a riot break out? Seeing his young husband worried, the husband explained, here, the people worship the God's church, but it's divided into two factions, East and West. These two denominations take turns governing politically, but they've had conflicts in the past year, causing the major disturbance. On the way to their room, Edward was still anxious about the incident. Reassuring his husband, the older husband affirmed the hotel was safe and they wouldn't be able to go sightseeing for the next few days. Arriving at the elevator, Edward asked his husband, Lucas, don't you plan to get involved and handle this? Lucas softly replied, the Empire has already sent troops to deal with it. I'm on vacation, so I don't need to show my face. Edward's face slightly lowered as he silently reflected on his understanding of his husband. Seeing his young husband looking tired from the long trip, Edward's husband Lucas gently stroked his cheek and kindly said, you must be very tired, go rest early later. His blushing husband replied, then thought it probably wasn't too serious an issue. In the beautiful room with the soft bed, the kitten Edward swiftly jumped into bed to relax. Suddenly his general husband lifted up his clothes to look, seeing the previous temporary tattoo had disappeared. The young husband explained that was a one-time thing. Hearing this, his husband suggested getting a permanent tattoo that wouldn't disappear to mark his ownership on his husband's body. Seeing his husband hesitating, husband Lucas acted pitiful to get consent. As if knowing ahead of time, Lucas took out a tattooing kit from his suitcase. Having schemed in advance, Lucas confidently told his little husband that he had secretly learned how. Trusting his husband, the obedient young husband laid down and Lucas started tattooing him. Lifting up his clothes and seeing his little husband's slender waist, the husband began the tattoo. Seeing his husband in pain, Lucas comforted and continued. Watching his husband marking him, Edward stared intently at Lucas, unexpectedly crying out when the tattoo was finished. To soothe the earlier pain, husband Lucas kissed his husband and affirmed Edward would forever be his, not allowed to leave him. A vigorous night made Lucas seem worn out the next day. The innocent Edward sweetly called his husband. 5 days later, the couple Lucas and Edward strolled through the flea market hand in hand, happily chatting about this place. It turns out there was a flea market near their hotel too. It was his first time experiencing it, so Lucas explained this place originally had no scale at all until Turner promoted it and registered the Sunny brand, opening stores globally. His young husband was surprised, so the Sunny brand belonged to him. Does he like the sun? Seeing his husband lost in thought, Lucas General flicked his forehead lightly, making the silly Edward look at him. The two joyfully experienced everything at the flea market. Arriving at the weapons booth, Lucas showed great interest. Seeing this, Edward suggested separating to explore what they each liked. In front of a stall with hand-knit scarves run by an auntie, Edward browsed, admiring how skillfully and intricately the scarves were knitted by hand. Seeing this, the scarf-knitting auntie offered to teach Edward how to knit. Before he could try, the crowds suddenly ran off in panic. Not understanding what was happening, the kind aunt advised Edward to quickly escape because the Eastern faction people had arrived. Lost and confused among the fleeing crowd, Edward tried contacting his husband, but the connection was cut, leaving him extremely terrified and worried. Having gotten separated in the panicked crowd, Edward suddenly bumped into a man wielding an axe. The man turned and swung at Edward, but fortunately Lucas appeared just in time to save him. With a kick, the man fell to the ground. Lucas pulled Edward's hand, running to the hotel. Suddenly, Edward stopped and said to wait, wasn't that their previous driver who brought them here? Edward looked softly at Lucas, hoping he could save the driver. General Lucas stroked his face to comfort his husband. Edward, getting involved in another planet's battles would be very dangerous. Suddenly, a headache made Lucas dizzy. Seeing his unwell husband, Edward asked what was wrong. Lucas regained his composure and affirmed he was fine and would go rescue the driver within 2 minutes. Lucas took a weapon and told his little husband to hide carefully. Watching his husband leave, Edward had an uneasy feeling something was off. Returning to the hotel, Edward grabbed Lucas's hand and called his name. Lucas frowned, turning back to say, "What's the matter?" Killing intent emanated from the general. Hearing screams from behind, "Help!" he turned to look back with a terrified expression. Behind his husband was a man wielding a scythe. Edward immediately ran towards Lucas. Grabbing his wife's hand, Lucas kicked the man, then hugged Edward into his arms to safety. After safely rescuing his wife and the driver, Lucas carried Edward back to the hotel. In the morning at the hotel, the lucky people who escaped the chaos, Lucas ordered the hotel receptionist to call doctors to examine the injured. Due to the seriousness of the incident, General Lucas called headquarters and requested staff to equip defenses against violence, departing in 15 minutes. Hearing this, Edward pulled Lucas's hand asking where he was going. Lucas coldly looked at his husband, then left to fulfill his duty. Watching his retreating back, Edward was taken aback, thinking the eyes that looked at him earlier were exactly the same as before he lost his memories. Could it be he recovered his memories already? No, he was probably overthinking it. Suddenly his brother called. To avoid suspicion, Edward slapped his face to regain composure. Seeing Edward pick up, his brother immediately asked about the violent situation where they were. Edward shook his head, denying it. From behind his brother, Turner suddenly hugged and affirmed Edward was lying. Edward was surprised to see Turner with his brother. His brother told Edward to tell the truth about the situation there, asking if he was hurt. Edward stood up and spun around so his brother would believe him. Edward looked at his brother with a sad face and asked, "You said Lucas? Could it be he already recovered his memories early?" Hearing his younger brother ask that, his older brother replied, "Why ask that?" Edward sadly told his brother about Lucas's demeanor that morning, exactly like before. Then he reassured himself that wasn't the case. Dr. Daniel would never guess wrong. After talking for a while, he suddenly realized something and said, "That's right, the same person's personality definitely won't change too drastically." Having an epiphany, he happily told his brother that when General Lucas lost his memory, he loved him at first sight and even treated him very well. It's possible Lucas liked him all along, just didn't show it. Hearing Edward affirm this, his brother thought, if he really liked you, why didn't he show it before, or did something happen between you two that made you think he likes you? Listening to his brother's analysis, silly Edward suddenly became silent, thinking that deep down, Lucas did like him a little, otherwise why would he treat him so well? Speaking of which, he remembered not having hurt or harmed Lucas's family back then. Seeing his brother sad recounting those things, his brother gently comforted with sweet words, "Good boy, don't be sad anymore, try to get through the next 2 months, you can still meet someone who truly loves you in the future." Receiving his brother's consolation, Edward recalled the tattoo marked by Lucas. Since he once promised to stay by his side for life, never leaving. After chatting for a while, Edward still wondered why his brother was with that Turner guy. When asked about himself, Turner provocatively answered how did he feel about it. To avoid his younger brother's suspicion, he replied he was helping him with some things. Hearing this, Edward felt sorry for his brother having to work with someone so difficult. Early morning in Turner's office, Turner pushed Edward's brother against his work desk, interrogating him about not withdrawing when with him. Upon receiving his answer, the ashamed Turner angrily pressed the brother down on the table, leaning in close to his ear, warning him not to call his younger brother good boy. If he ever heard it, whatever happens, the brother would have to bear it himself. Hearing his warning, the brother whispered back teasingly, "How childish, that's my younger brother." Turner then hugged him, saying in his eyes there could only be him. In the hotel room, the sound of the door opening lightly woke Edward up. Seeing her husband return, he leapt to hug and smother him in warm kisses. Seeing his wife take initiative, the embarrassed husband pushed him away, wanting to shower. To rekindle their intimacy, Edward proactively went to prepare a bath, wanting to do something. Edward was preparing the water and was ready to pleasure Lucas as soon as his husband took off his shirt, but unfortunately the shy husband wanted Edward to bathe himself. Seeing his unusual behavior, Edward was a bit surprised. He approached Lucas and asked if he was still mad about what happened that morning. Edward hurried to hug Lucas and admitted his mistake. This time the accident was beyond his control. He couldn't contact or find Lucas and got caught up in the chaos. Seeing Lucas not saying anything, Edward thought he was still upset, so he took the initiative to express his affection. It turned out that what his husband wanted him to do was just that. Seeing his hesitant look when noticing the tattoo, Edward was surprised and said, "Why like that? Previously every time you saw it you were very happy." After saying so, the husband went to get things. The shy little wife replied, "Recently you didn't let me use it, right? Besides, you used up all the stuff you took away yourself." The sound of the shower mixing with the sweet words of the newlyweds created a romantic atmosphere. The next morning at the hotel, looking at his wife sleeping in his arms, the husband suddenly wanted to give his wife a very romantic morning during their vacation. After finishing up, the husband gently covered his little wife with a thin blanket, but affection would always be like that, interspersed with misunderstandings and missed moments. After a passionate night, Lucas still wanted to continue, but Edward felt uncomfortable. He wanted his husband to pull out and wait for him to recover. The two comforted each other affectionately, creating a peaceful and romantic atmosphere. However, the sound of Fairy's call broke the mood. Lucas carefully listened on the phone. Even though his spouse was right next to him, he was still discreet to ensure secrecy was protected. Edward's face was filled with sadness and grief, wondering if his husband was doing something on the satellite that betrayed the military's legal orders. Lucas quickly slipped into his wife's arms like a puppy needing comfort. He softly reassured him that it was nothing, he just had some things to deal with there, so he had to go. Hearing these words, Edward's expression suddenly became more relaxed and he hugged Lucas. A while later, General Lucas was at the military hospital to hear about his medical condition. Noticing abnormalities in his brain scans, the doctor immediately wanted to know what happened that day. Lucas then remembered his alternate personality appearing at the very moment when he was most desperate, saving Edward from the knife by a hair's breadth. At that moment, the current Lucas was like a powerless husband watching his wife intimate with another man. It was then that he realized he still couldn't compete with the other guy. It wasn't until after the family bonding exercise session that Lucas realized he had reverted back to his normal self. According to the expert's assessment, as the toxins continued to decrease, the other guy would return in about 2 months. At this point, General Lucas couldn't help but ask Ferry about his previous married life, as he didn't possess those memories and could only rely on those around him. The Chen family had already been exiled from the satellite for their crimes, but thanks to Lucas meeting with the Minister of Justice, their punishment was reduced. And if not for his father-in-law's illness, the whole family would have lived more affluently. Although General Lucas found out about the situation quite late, he still didn't want to confront it, both because of the past events and because Edward didn't want to talk about it. Standing outside his father-in-law's hospital room looking at little Xiao Gus sleeping next to his bedside, Lucas sighed deeply at that moment, as if realizing this relationship had been intertwined with misunderstandings and missed opportunities for too long. He carefully draped a coat over Edward but noticed the other was showing signs of waking up. It was just like almost getting caught red-handed, and he darted out of there in the blink of an eye. On the way home, both Lucas and his assistant didn't understand why Edward loved her husband so much yet still chose divorce. A strange thought suddenly occurred to Lucas that the guy named General Lucas lived promiscuously and wanted to turn his wife's head into a grassland. Ferry immediately dismissed this thought. To him, although General Lucas was not the best spouse, he was absolutely faithful due to his clean personal life. General Edward then considered transferring all the money to Edward, but with such a long string of numbers it would take a very long time. Even a joint account would take time to open, and if the divorce papers went through, it would be cancelled anyway. Ferry also understood Edward's personality. He wouldn't take his husband's money, which made Lucas feel a little sad. When Lucas came home that evening, as soon as he entered, he saw Edward talking with Mr. Chen. Edward wanted to bring local specialties for his father, but the other side refused for fear of not being able to eat it all. Lucas affectionately and tenderly kissed Edward's beautiful face. The old man on the other side had to cough a few times to remind the young couple. He wanted Edward to give the remaining specialties to his older brother, which is when they realized the older son was staying with Ethan. Suddenly, both the old man and Lucas felt a jolt of concern. Edward noticed something was wrong and wanted to know what happened to those two, or if Ethan was a bad person. However, Mr. Chen avoided his son's question and said he needed to rest. At the same time, he didn't forget to instruct Edward to live well in the future. As for Edward, he also reminded his father to take medicine on time and go for a walk if he got bored. Meanwhile, Lucas seemed to understand where his own illness came from. The toxins had created the alternate personality that took over his body. To recover, he had to actively rest. He quickly sent Ferry a letter. Edward grabbed his husband's hand and then sat on Lucas' lap, much to Lucas' great surprise. Edward said he was just helping Lucas take off his jacket like every day. Clearly this was something Lucas asked him to do every day while clinging to Edward. Hearing this, General Lucas was unhappy about the intimacy between the other personality and his wife. He wanted to know what happened next. Edward leaned down to kiss Lucas and then told his husband to wait for a surprise in a few minutes. Soon, Edward reappeared in an attractive bunny lingerie outfit. Contrary to what Edward thought, Lucas immediately rolled Edward up like a sushi roll with 2 seaweed strips stuck on top. Perhaps the heart and mind were not in agreement. While Lucas' mouth said for his wife to change into something else, his ears turned as red as tomatoes. Just as Edward was disappointed to see Lucas leave, sweet little Edward eagerly welcomed him back and showed off helping Edward make dinner. Hearing his husband greet little Edward, anxiety instantly arose in Edward's heart because this was not the way the current Lucas spoke, rather, it belonged to the old Lucas. Edward was half believing, half doubting, and wondering to himself if Lucas had really returned. At the second checkup the next morning, Edward was anxious, wondering if Lucas had recovered his memories, wanting to go to the hospital with him to check if recovery was possible. Hearing Dr. Cooper say that his husband's body was gradually getting healthier so his memories could awaken first, after confirming the illness would soon recover, a hint of sadness flashed across Edward's face. Just as Dr. Cooper reminded Edward to wait there while he had to take care of other patients, Edward's eyes turned red and tears were about to fall. Edward was conflicted on whether to agree to approve the divorce petition as he was about to lose the current Lucas. This marriage had already been rated too poorly. Just when Edward was about to agree, a little monster with a shark tail came in. It was the symbiotic body chopper. Edward was scared by it and quickly turned off the information screen. Seeing the injured child, he wanted to treat it despite Chopper's angry attitude demanding to stay away. It even resented Edward calling himself its older brother. However, Edward's gentle care made Chopper unable to reject him further. Chopper even said that if he wasn't injured, he would definitely disguise himself so the two wouldn't meet. Suddenly, guns surrounded them and strangers believed Edward and Chopper were assassins who killed Chief Minister Tai. Despite Edward's denial, they arrested him anyway. At this time, Lucas walked in to shield Edward, but upon learning his wife was involved in the assassination attempt, he distanced Edward a bit due to military rules to avoid suspicion, ignoring Edward clinging to him trying to explain. Because of this action, Edward felt devastated. Perhaps he sensed Lucas' change in personality, which had become cold and disgusted. General Lucas negotiated with them in the hallway. Even though they believed his wife might be hiding her true face, to Lucas, after 7 years together, Edward was an upright and reasonable person. Lucas was willing to relinquish his military rank to guarantee Edward's freedom and bear the consequences if Edward really did something wrong. Hearing Lucas say this, they didn't make things difficult anymore. When Lucas returned to the room, Edward immediately asked if he remembered yet. Isaac patted Lucas on the shoulder and happily announced it was just because of the toxins that Edward's husband developed an alternate personality and changed his temperament. Over time he would soon recover, while also revealing that day was fast approaching. After hearing this, Edward suddenly felt extremely lost. If it really was just an alternate personality, then the husband who brought happiness to Edward day and night would disappear one day. It was like a bolt from the blue. Isaac came over to pat Lucas on the shoulder, then left to explain things clearly to Lucas while going to do his own job. As for Edward, it was as if he had awakened from a beautiful dream. He realized the love he had mistakenly thought existed because Lucas had feelings and hoped he could fight for it after Lucas recovered, but in the end it was only because Lucas didn't remember his past self that he doted and loved Edward. Edward carefully looked up at the man in front of him, wanting to confirm if the primary personality had really returned. Lucas calmly replied that he didn't remember anything about the time the two were together and didn't forget to say that Edward shouldn't blame those acts with that guy on him. Edward lowered his face to hide the pain and agreed. He silently followed Lucas back but hesitated for a moment when the person taking him back was no longer Fairy. Without thinking more, Edward got on the plane but accidentally tripped because he wasn't paying attention. Fortunately, Lucas caught him. Suddenly, Edward felt this contact was very distant. He thanked Lucas and quickly turned away. Lucas tightly gripped his hand, full of loss, and could only remind Edward to be careful. Throughout the flight, Edward remembered his previous husband. Lucas had always coldly rejected intimacy no matter what methods were used, leading to many grievances. But since the other personality appeared, Edward felt his heart warmed. He remembered Lucas in his gentle and caring version. By the time they returned home, Edward always tried not to lose face, refusing help and even thanking Lucas, although the eyes before him had lost their happiness. General Lucas also realized this. He followed his wife into the room to talk, surprising Edward because the old him would never come here. With one on the bed and one sitting on a chair, Edward asked about the return of the other Lucas, causing his face to darken. It felt like he was jealous with the third party being himself because Lucas believed Edward didn't accept him and only missed the other guy, even though Edward could distinguish between them. Seeing that uncomfortable expression, Edward briefly considered whether Lucas was jealous that his wife was with another man. But thinking back to the past, he shook his head and quickly dismissed this strange idea. Witnessing Edward longing for the other personality and wanting to be with him even if only for 2 months, Lucas tightly clenched his fists. He informed Edward of his decision to have surgery to erase the other personality. This would shorten the intended time frame to 10 days from now. This news horrified Edward as he looked at Lucas as if wanting to deny what his ears just heard. There were only 10 short days left before the other Lucas would disappear. Just as Edward wanted to find a way to keep the second personality, General Lucas frowned unhappily and questioned if Edward liked that guy so much. Lucas then stood up and approached Edward, wanting to touch him, but his head suddenly felt painful. Soon the other personality emerged. Edward had buried his face in the pillow crying because the one who treated him gently and loved him, the one who promised to travel with him, was about to never see him again. Lucas lifted Edward's tear-stained face and gently comforted him like soothing a child. Realizing these actions belonged to his beloved husband, Edward hugged him tightly and cried loudly. He didn't want Lucas to disappear even though he knew the other shouldn't exist. Lucas checked the time left while comforting Edward that he was just a part of the real Lucas. Without the accident he couldn't have emerged. However, Edward repeatedly denied this fact because General Lucas had never loved him even a little. But hearing Lucas jokingly suggest taking over this body, Edward shook his head in refusal. Lucas instructed and then gently kissed those small lips, but upon realizing he himself was about to be erased, he panicked and wanted to know the reason. Lucas admitted the mental strength of his past self was too strong, leading to lack of control, and with the toxins decreasing it became even more disadvantageous. He then threatened to scare Edward, making him bristle like a little cat. Knowing his wife would miss the memories of the past few days and then wither away, Lucas coaxed him, but at least he still possessed those days. He then played another trick, covering Edward's eyes with his hand and asking if Edward felt like he was cheating when not looking at Lucas. Hearing this, Edward's face turned as red as a ripe tomato, thinking it was the wrong judgment because although their attitudes differed, it was still the same body. So it couldn't be considered adultery. The bristled-up Edward hugged her husband as if to sulk. Although Lucas was still gentle, his face revealed fear and worry because soon he would never be able to return.